In this short session, I'm going to provide an overview of how to get started with the Morpheus Plugin Framework. It's going to be an introduction to the topic only. The intent is to provide footholds for users wishing to take the next steps. More will follow from the enablement team. First, some caveats. This video is presented by a Morpheus field engineer with some general programming experience, but I'm not a Java Groovy developer, and I haven't been involved with the development of the Morpheus stack or indeed the Morpheus Plugin Framework. Hopefully, most of the terminology and concepts explained here are correct, and when we get to the code, whilst it all builds and works and demonstrates a use case, again, it's not guaranteed to be best practice. That said, this video does serve to demonstrate what can be accomplished without specific domain knowledge of Java or Groovy, using the documentation that's already out there and some iteration, some trial and error. In the presentation, we're going to cover these key points, some background to the framework. We'll look at why Morpheus developed the plugin framework. Again, speaking not as one of the core team involved with this, but the advantages of a plugin framework. We'll look at what can currently be built with the framework, the providers, as it were, of that framework. We'll call out some considerations which are interesting when embarking on plugin development, worth knowing up front. We'll then call out several important or useful resources that it's good to be aware of. And we'll look at a sample plugin in the Morpheus UI and call out some of its functionality, what it does. And finally, we'll review that same plugin from a code perspective. There's a repository that has all that information, all that code in it. So background. Morpheus is moving towards a more modular development approach. Indeed, from version 6, installed plugins ship with Morpheus itself and provide functionality that was previously provided by the core. This has many advantages. It allows the core development team to focus on the Morpheus core. It avoids having to maintain a lot of functionality that may be used infrequently by some customers, but has the potential to go stale in the product and create a maintenance headache. There's also a proliferation of integration types, far too many potentially to continue handling within the core product. So a plugin framework allows you, the customer, to build what it is that you need. It allows the product to be extended by the customer to suit their particular use cases and workflows. And finally, it brings a community, or potentially brings a community effort to Morpheus, where new functionality can be developed by anyone with a modicum of knowledge, and that knowledge can be shared, and potentially existing plugins that are out there can be maintained by many people. So that's something about the background and the advantages of this approach. So on to the providers. Providers are classes in the framework that developers will extend in order to interact with Morpheus in a particular way. For example, providing custom approvals workflows. At the moment there are 9 providers. I've listed them on the screen. For approvals, custom cipher solutions, interfacing with your own preferred DNS providers to create records on provision. A custom tabs provider, which allows instance views to be extended to surface information about the instance that may not be there already. IP address management, tasks for integrating into workflows, doing things that can't currently be done. Custom reports, which allow you to surface information about your clouds, your users, your instances, your virtual machines that may not already be part of the core reporting suite. Clouds, that's the big one. If you want to use a particular cloud that Morpheus does not support, there is now nothing to stop you developing your own using the plugin. And backup is the final provider. Some considerations before you start. Some Java Groovy expertise is obviously beneficial, but not essential. Providing you can read code, however, it would reduce friction. Other languages may be supported by the framework in future. Kotlin has been mentioned, but they're likely to always be languages that are or do compile for the Java virtual machine. The plugin framework is now at version 0.14, so it is pre-version 1, and that is worth stating. So breaking changes in that API, that SDK, are theoretically still possible. The framework follows an MVC pattern with views using handlebars templating syntax by default, but it is possible to bring your own rendering tools. Gradle is used for build, but most projects, plugin projects, supply a wrapper, which is a script to manage the dependencies of the project such that only Java is the real dependency. Or at least that's what I found. Plugins are installed in Morpheus on the admin integration plugins page, which we'll see. And there's also a route for using the API and command line interface for CRUD operations on plugins. Some resources that we need to discuss or call out. I'm not going to go into them here, but these are resources that are worth checking out. You've got the Morpheus Developer Zone, which is the main resource for developers of plugins. It contains documentation, the framework class API, and a link to the GitHub repository where the plugin core is based, the thing that you're extending and implementing in when you create a plugin. There's the Morpheus Exchange, which has a growing collection of plugins included with source code. Many of those plugins now leveraged by Morpheus itself. And there's also a section within the discussion forum at discuss.morpheusdata.com specifically on plugins. So if you have questions, a great place to go and look first of all and potentially ask your question is in the discussion forum. Next, we're going to talk about an example plugin, and I'm going to jump into my Morpheus appliance. Now we're on my Morpheus appliance, and we can see that we have two instances. First of them is named dummy text service -1, -01 rather, and tab 2. This plugin is a custom tab plugin and displays information from the database for one of these instances, this instance. The idea being that that information is populated by a provisioning workflow to the database where the instance is provisioned and can be reported back using the custom tab. Before we talk about how this was installed, let's just demonstrate the plugin and what it does. So this instance has no managed services attached to it. So we display the managed services custom tab, which is what the plugin provides for us. And we have this view that says there's no managed services, and they obviously have a cost of 0. In terms of the currency, this plugin does not use localization, but it can provide either a pounds symbol, British pound symbol, US dollar symbol, or euro symbol based on the currency that the tenant or account is set to. If we return to our instances and visit the instance which does have managed services attached or should have, we see that we have 6 managed services for this instance. The total cost is £795. The average cost is £132.50. And we call out the most expensive service. If cost was a factor, then we could flag the most expensive service here, and that would be a good way to assess impact and save us having to trawl this list here. You can see that this plugin also allows us to select and delete services from the database. And in order to do that, we've had to create a separate database connection. The framework as is provides a read-only connection for querying data via SQL, and that's primarily intended for the reports plugin use case, but that can be used within the tab provider, which provides an alternative user interface. But in order to write back to the database, which includes delete, we've established a separate database connection to allow us to do that. And that is part of the plugin's configuration, which we'll cover shortly. So let's delete a single service. We get a confirmation dialog, and it's gone. And you notice that these stats don't immediately update. That is possible to do. We haven't done that in this use case. But to update everything, we simply refresh the page. This plugin implements a controller. The front end uses an asynchronous JavaScript request to send data to the controller, which the controller then parses out and actions with a delete query in the database. Now, it's worth saying that the controller, which is an endpoint on Morpheus, a custom endpoint, at the moment only supports GET request. So this information about the services to delete, manage 1, manage 5, is encoded to the query string and sent as part of that request. Because we can't send a GET request with a JSON request body using the JavaScript fetch API. And that is everything that this does. In terms of styling, it's worth touching on. By copying the HTML structure of alternative pages, for example, instances, we can leverage, or we get, a lot of this styling for free because the classes are copied over too. That's just worth saying. If you want to emulate the look and feel of Morpheus to keep things looking consistent, then you would use your browser inspector to isolate the HTML code that you wanted to use and then implement that in your view. But we'll get to that when we talk about the code. Finally, let's talk about the installation. Plugins are installed on the administration integrations page and on the plugins tab. And Morpheus ships with a whole host of plugins installed with it out of the box. But here we can see the managed service instance tab plugin that we've just been looking at. We have some metadata about the plugin, such as name, description, which we set within the plugin itself, also the version, whether it's enabled or not. It's actually controlled in the settings. And within the settings, we also have the ability to provide custom configuration for the plugin. And in this case, we're providing configuration for the database connection that we've used to provide delete. Now, this could be, or probably should be, a separate database, the Morpheus, but in our case, it is the Morpheus database, but we have a separate user which has permissions to delete only on this table, I believe. And that is the plugin demonstration complete. In the next part of the presentation, we'll look at the code that makes up this plugin. So in this third and final section of the presentation, I want to run through the code that comprises the plugin we've just seen, the custom tab plugin, at a very high level. We won't be jumping into lots of business logic, but I just want to introduce the structure of a plugin which generally follow the same pattern with the addition of 1 or 2 files, depending on what type of provider you are extending. In the repository, we've got a README with some good documentation. some screen grabs to show what you're going to get. We have a section titled For Learning, which demonstrates or covers the concepts that this plugin performs. And that's useful if you want to use this as a jumping off point for your own development. To what extent do these things overlap with what you may want to achieve? We have some scripts for loading data into your database, be that Morpheus or an external database. And they are provided in the migrations folder. We have an SQL script for creating the table and also seeding that table with some data. And you can see how all the data is assigned to dummy text service -01. So once installed, if you create an instance with that name, then this dummy data will appear on the custom tab of that instance. We have a properties file. Well, before we cover the properties file, we also have two files, Gradle W and Gradle WBAT. These are the wrappers which handle the dependencies. It means that we don't have to replicate a particular environment completely in order to build this plugin. The only thing we must have is a Java version installed. For my purposes, I think I was using Java version 16. These wrapper scripts will handle the remainder of the dependencies. We have a properties file for Gradle, which tells us what dependencies, what versions we are attached to. And we shouldn't need to edit this much. This value here is worth calling out. This is the plugin API version. We're currently using the latest 0.140. And if you were to use a later one or earlier one, that is where you would change that value. The plugin version obviously is maintained here too, should you wish to version your code, your plugin. And you recall that when we were in the Morpheus user interface, the version was 0.01, which is what we have here. We have a build Gradle file. There is not much to maintain in here. One thing that we do need to call out is a requirement to specify the plugin class in this file. Failure to do that or misname it will cause issues with your builds. And finally, you can see we have a wrapper task make, which uses tasks shadow jar to build the plugin, and then we move the plugin. And then we also additionally remove all the artifacts which are excluded from the git ignore, but also are removed upon build, so that your final jar file is included in the plugin folder. And then we have the plugin source itself, in which we have three directories, one for assets, be that images, JavaScript, or style sheets. They would be included in here. Then we have our source folder, which contains our views and our class. And you can see we have the actual plugin class, which extends plugin. We also have the provider, which we register in the plugin. And here we're basically extending the abstract instance tab provider by overwriting and augmenting its functionality. And finally, we have a file for the controller, which implements an endpoint, a route on the server. And we specify this route, but it's important to call out that this route will actually resolve at your appliance URL /plugin/managed-services/delete. You don't need to specify a plugin here, but that is how plugin routes work. And the rest of this is business logic. In terms of the process, the plugin managed service tab plugin class extends plugin. We initialize everything. We set the metadata that we've seen in the the user interface for the name and the description. Failure to specify this metadata will not cause the build to fail, but you will have no description in the plugin settings page, and you'll have a rather ugly looking class name in preference to this name. We register the provider, our tab provider, and then we basically create a new controller instance and register that. Then we set permissions to say who can use this. This will establish a new permission in Morpheus for roles purposes, and that permission is Manage Service Tab Plugin. And the remainder is about specifying options, and we use these options within the plugin settings for the database connection, and that's how we create those. The provider itself is mostly business logic. We have two methods, the first of which governs whether this will display to a user, so they can only see it if they have permissions which match. And the second method is the render template, which assembles the data required for the view. And then all of this is business logic. For the controller, again, mostly business logic. And it's commented so that hopefully it's a good jumping off point for those that want to reuse it. And then we have the views, which are handlebars templates. We have two views, first of which is implemented where there is no data to see. It's very simple, only takes the currency symbol from the controller. The second of which is more complex but is achieving the same thing. We have scripts in line for all of the JavaScript handling the events such as button clicks and confirm, etc. And we have utility functions for making the query string that we have to send to the controller. We have some custom styling. There isn't much of that used, but one or two elements where I wanted to try and improve my code. And then we have the output. So at the top we have the overview starting our dashboard metrics. We have a count. We have the currency symbol, the total. Everything is assembled server side and passed to the view. And then we also have detail, which iterates through all of the rows of data that can be found for this particular instance name. And with that, the presentation is complete. Just to recap, the three pieces, three parts. In the first part, we discussed the plugin framework via a series of slides. We discussed the use case for a framework and why it was maybe preferable to utilize a modular approach. In the second part of the presentation, we looked at a custom plugin developed internally by Morpheus as an example. That plugin demonstrated a few key concepts such as rendering data from a table in the view, writing back to a table using an additional database connection, configuration of the plugin in its settings, and also the use of a controller to receive data from the front end, from the view, that was sent asynchronously to that controller. And then in the third part of the presentation, we've looked at this repository, albeit at a very high level, to cover the main components, the main files which are included, and talk briefly about the code that is in here. It is commented and it is intended for reuse, so hopefully it is a reasonable starting off point for those of you that wish to build certainly a custom tab